In the spring of 1947, on a soundstage the size of 2 football fields, something broke. The set was sealed and blacked out, guarded by studio police. Roaring fires blazed as dozens of drummers pounded authentic voodoo rhythms into the artificial darkness. At the center stood a 24-year-old woman in a dress worth more than most Americans earned in 2 years, her face painted and perfected after 4 hours in makeup. Her name was Judy Garland, and she was about to shatter. What happened next, whether she ran screaming across the stage or simply collapsed from exhaustion, depends on which account you believe. The studio production reports say nothing. The biographers, writing decades later, describe terror and hysteria. The truth lies somewhere in that silence, in the gap between what Hollywood wanted the world to see and what was actually happening behind the sealed doors of its dream factory. This is not a story about a single collapse. It is the story of a system that ground up its most valuable assets and called it magic. It is about a girl who became a symbol of American innocence while being systematically destroyed by the very empire that created her. And it is about the moment when that system's contradictions became impossible to hide. Part 1. The Factory of Dreams. To understand what happened to Judy Garland requires understanding what Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was in its absolute prime. In the late 1930s, MGM was not simply a movie studio. It was an industrial empire that controlled every aspect of filmmaking from conception to exhibition, from the stars who appeared on screen to the theaters where audiences watched them. The system was built on vertical integration. MGM produced the films, distributed them through its own network, and owned the theaters that showed them. This monopoly generated extraordinary profits and gave the studio unprecedented control over American entertainment. Louis B. Mayer, the studio's vice president and general manager, presided over this empire with the conviction that he was not merely making movies, but shaping American values themselves. The heart of MGM's operation was its contract system. Young performers, sometimes barely teenagers, were signed to 7-year agreements that gave the studio ownership of their professional lives. The studio decided which films they would make, which roles they would play, when they would work, and how they would appear in public. These contracts could be extended through suspension clauses. If an actor refused a role or became ill, the studio could simply pause the contract and add that lost time to the end of the 7 years. For the stars who succeeded, the rewards were extraordinary. For those who struggled, the system was merciless. Frances Ethel Gum arrived at MGM in September 1935, shortly after turning 13. She had been performing since she was 2.5 years old, pushed into vaudeville by a mother who saw in her youngest daughter a ticket to something better. MGM talent scouts saw what Ethel Gum had seen, a voice that could break hearts and a face that radiated vulnerability and hope in equal measure. The studio renamed her Judy Garland. It assigned her to producer Arthur Freed and put her into a series of musicals with Mickey Rooney, the studio's biggest box office draw. Before she turned 15, she was already taking Benzedrine and Seconal regularly, amphetamines to keep her energized through 18-hour filming days, barbiturates to bring her down afterward so she could sleep. This was not an aberration. This was the system. The pharmaceutical regimen had a clinical simplicity to it. Studio doctors administered amphetamine sulfate, marketed as Benzedrine, each morning before filming. The drugs suppressed appetite and provided artificial energy, allowing young performers to maintain the grueling schedules that multi-picture deals demanded. After filming wrapped, sometimes past midnight, the same doctors provided barbiturates, Seconal or Nembutal, to counteract the stimulants and induce sleep. After 4 hours of unconsciousness, the cycle began again. The stated purposes were efficiency and image control. Garland was called the Little Hunchback by Louis B. Mayer himself, who believed her body type was wrong for stardom. The amphetamines kept her thin. The extended work hours maximized the studio's return on investment during a star's peak marketability. And the control it gave the studio over every aspect of a performer's physical and psychological state was absolute. No one questioned it because the results were extraordinary. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz made Judy Garland into an American icon. Her performance of Over the Rainbow became one of the defining cultural moments of the century. She was 16 years old and already completely addicted to the pills that kept the system running. The public saw a miracle child. The studio saw a production unit that needed optimization. And Garland herself was beginning to understand what she had become. Part 2. The Machine Accelerates. The success of The Wizard of Oz did not bring relief. It brought more work. Between 1939 and 1943, Garland made 13 feature films. She was paired repeatedly with Mickey Rooney in a series of Let's Put on a Show musicals that became massive commercial successes. Babes in Arms, Strike Up the Band, Babes on Broadway, Girl Crazy. The formula worked and MGM exploited it relentlessly. The schedule was punishing. Filming often ran 16 to 18 hours per day. Between pictures, there were press obligations, publicity appearances, radio performances, and promotional tours. The studio controlled her diet with an intensity that bordered on cruelty, primarily coffee, chicken soup, and cigarettes instead of full meals. Her weight was monitored constantly. Any deviation from the prescribed image brought immediate intervention. The pharmaceutical cycle continued without interruption. Garland would later describe the routine with remarkable clarity. They would give her pills to keep her on her feet long after she was exhausted. Then they would take her to the studio hospital and knock her out with sleeping pills. After 4 hours, they would wake her up and give her more stimulants so she could work 72 hours in a row. This was normal. This was how the system worked. The culture of silence around these practices was absolute. No one discussed it publicly because the machine worked. The films made money. The stars looked perfect. The American public believed in the dream that MGM was selling. And anyone who questioned the cost was replaced. By 1943, cracks were beginning to show. During the filming of Girl Crazy, director Busby Berkeley's demanding methods pushed Garland to the point where she required bed rest. Her relationship with Berkeley, already strained from earlier productions, became openly hostile. But the film was completed and released to strong box office. The machine continued. What no one acknowledged publicly was the accumulating damage. The long-term effects of continuous amphetamine and barbiturate use were beginning to manifest. Severe insomnia, hallucinations, mood swings that ranged from manic energy to suicidal depression, physical exhaustion that no amount of artificial stimulation could overcome, and a growing awareness on Garland's part that she was trapped in a system that would use her until she broke. The studio's response to these warning signs was to increase pharmaceutical intervention and psychiatric supervision while maintaining the production schedule. Beginning in the mid-1940s, Howard Strickling, MGM's head of publicity and one of the studio's legendary fixers, arranged for Garland to see psychiatrists 5 mornings per week. This would continue for 20 years. The goal was not recovery, but management, keeping her functional enough to work while controlling the narrative about her health. In 1945, Garland married director Vincente Minnelli, a man she had worked with on Meet Me in St. Louis. The marriage was partly genuine affection and partly studio orchestration. MGM's fixers regularly orchestrated relationships for their stars, managing their personal lives as carefully as their professional careers. The following year, she gave birth to her daughter Liza. For a brief period, there seemed to be hope for something resembling a normal life. That hope was an illusion. Part 3. The Breaking Point. In February 1947, MGM put Judy Garland into The Pirate, a lavish Technicolor musical based on a Broadway play. Her husband Vincente Minnelli would direct. Gene Kelly would co-star. The score was written by Cole Porter. On paper, it should have been a triumph. Instead, it became a catastrophe. The production began on February 17, 1947. Almost immediately, problems emerged. Garland had just completed a grueling schedule with minimal rest, multiple films back-to-back with no significant break. She had been promised vacation time. It never materialized. Now she was being pushed into another demanding production with a director whose perfectionism, however well-intentioned, added pressure she could no longer withstand. The pattern that emerged would define the entire production. Garland would arrive late, or not at all. When she did appear, she would work intensely for hours, and then collapse. The studio would send her home, or to a sanitarium for rest. She would return, and the cycle would repeat. Across roughly 135 days of filming and rehearsals, she was absent for 99. The Voodoo musical number was pre-recorded on April 10, 1947. The filming took place in mid-April on an enormous soundstage. MGM had built a set that replicated an authentic voodoo ceremony with a level of detail that bordered on the obsessive. The stage was blacked out completely. The doors were sealed and guarded by studio police. Roaring fires blazed on the set. Dozens of drummers pounded out rhythms that were meant to be authentically Caribbean and primitively powerful. Garland spent 4 hours in makeup. The costume she wore was valued at $125,000, a staggering sum that reflected MGM's commitment to visual spectacle. When she finally appeared on set, something was clearly wrong. Multiple biographical accounts describe what happened next, though the specific details vary in ways that reveal how thoroughly the studio controlled information, even decades later. Some sources report that Garland began screaming that she was going to burn to death, that they wanted her to burn. Others describe a quieter collapse, a sudden inability to continue. Director Vincente Minnelli reportedly tried to calm her. Some accounts claim she approached extras individually asking if they had Benzedrine. Others say she simply broke down crying and laughing simultaneously, completely hysterical. What we know with certainty is this: Wally Worsley's daily production reports, the official studio documentation of what happened each day, do not mention this incident at all. That silence is extraordinarily revealing. Either the incident was less dramatic than later accounts suggest, or it was so disturbing that even the production paperwork, internal documents never meant for public consumption, was sanitized to remove evidence of the breakdown. Film historians have noted this absence carefully. It could indicate discomfort at witnessing the event. It could suggest the incident was exaggerated from a less dramatic breakdown in later retellings. Or it could demonstrate the effectiveness of MGM's system for concealing crisis, even in its own internal records. Garland did not immediately stop working after this collapse. She continued through late June, struggling through each day. On June 28th, during rehearsals for the Be a Clown number, she suffered another nervous collapse. Her final day of principal photography was July 16, 1947. She worked from 10:35 in the morning until 6:05 in the evening, completing over 25 takes. Then she left MGM and did not return for weeks. The voodoo number itself was cut from the film entirely after preview audiences found the choreography overly sexual. Louis B. Mayer allegedly ordered the negative burned, fearing police raids if it was ever exhibited. No footage survives. It likely was destroyed in the massive MGM vault fire of 1965. So the sequence that broke Judy Garland exists now only in memory and disputed accounts, a ghost at the center of a ghost story. Part 4. The Silence and the Truth. What the public read about Judy Garland's health crisis in 1947 was carefully controlled. The trade papers, Variety, and The Hollywood Reporter maintained professional silence about the production chaos consuming the pirate. Their coverage focused exclusively on routine announcements, casting decisions, production start dates, technical crew changes when cinematographer Harry Stradling fell ill and was replaced by George Falsey. What did not appear in the trades, any mention of Garland missing 99 days of production, any discussion of cost overruns that would eventually push the film $553,000 over budget, any acknowledgement of her hospitalization or the reasons behind it. This was not accidental. The trade press functioned essentially as an extension of studio publicity departments. They reported what the studios wanted reported. The entertainment industry had developed an extraordinarily effective system for controlling narrative, and that system extended to news coverage itself. Only the gossip columnists broke through the wall of silence, and only after the crisis became impossible to conceal. On July 18, 1947, 2 days after Garland's final shooting day, Hedda Hopper and Jack Le published columns reporting her recent physical breakdown. Le went further than most would dare, mentioning that it was a possible result of her Benzedrine addiction. This represented a significant breach in the system. But even the gossip press used euphemistic language. Nervous collapse, physical exhaustion, health troubles. The full reality that one of Hollywood's biggest stars had broken down on set, was struggling with severe drug dependency created by the studio itself, and had just attempted suicide, remained hidden. Because the day after completing her final work on the pirate, or possibly the same day, Judy Garland locked herself in a bathroom and made minor cuts to her wrist with a shard of broken glass. Her mother broke down the door before serious injury occurred. The wounds were characterized as superficial, but the intent was clear. On July 19, 1947, Garland was taken to the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where she remained for approximately 2 weeks. The choice of institution reveals something important about how MGM handled the crisis. Austin Riggs was not a typical psychiatric facility. Founded in 1913, it was an open, voluntary residential treatment center that emphasized intensive psychotherapy rather than the extreme interventions common in 1947, electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, or lobotomy. The medical director in 1947 was Robert P. Knight, a friend of Anna Freud, who would later become president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychoanalytic Association. The treatment philosophy emphasized psychodynamic talk therapy, structured daily routine, and patient authority and responsibility. This was in many ways progressive care for the era. Garland was not locked in an asylum. She was given space to recover with professional support. Press reports from August 7th mentioned her attending a show at the Berkshire Playhouse and visiting the Stockbridge Golf Club. The public was told she was resting in the East due to exhaustion. The suicide attempt was not mentioned. The pills were not discussed. The system that had brought her to this point remained invisible. The immediate outcome appeared positive. Garland returned to Los Angeles on August 20th. On August 29th, she attended a rough-cut screening of The Pirate with producer Arthur Freed, Vincente Minnelli, Cole Porter, and Irving Berlin. By late August, she had begun work on Easter Parade, with her husband Minnelli removed as director at her request. The film, co-starring Fred Astaire, became MGM's highest-grossing musical of 1948 and Garland's top-grossing film to date. The crisis appeared to have passed. The machine was working again. But nothing fundamental had changed. The pharmaceutical system continued. The production schedules remained relentless. The underlying issues, years of exploitation, unresolved trauma, systematic drug dependency, went unaddressed. The 2-week hospitalization had treated the symptom, not the disease. And the disease was the studio system itself. Part 5. The Testimony of Others. Years later, when the studio system had collapsed and some participants felt free to speak, pieces of the truth emerged. The most explicit corroboration came from an unexpected source, Debbie Reynolds. In her 2013 memoir Unsinkable, Reynolds described her experience filming Singin' in the Rain in 1952. When her doctor advised taking a week off due to exhaustion, MGM studio chief Arthur Freed, the same producer who had overseen so many of Garland's films, told her to see a different doctor and get vitamin shots from his doctor. Reynolds wrote explicitly, these were possibly the same vitamins that ruined Judy Garland. She continued, my doctor insisted that I stay in bed. That decision may have saved me from a life on stimulants. Reynolds understood what she was being offered and why she needed to refuse it. The system was still operating in 1952, still offering the same pharmaceutical solution to the problem of exhausted performers. Reynolds survived because she resisted. Garland had been too young, too controlled, too thoroughly embedded in the system to resist when it began. Mickey Rooney's testimony presents contradictions that themselves reveal something important. Multiple sources report that he and Garland were given pills together during their years making the MGM musicals that established both their careers. Garland herself stated they would be given stimulants, worked to exhaustion, taken to the studio hospital, and knocked unconscious with barbiturates, then awakened after 4 hours and given more amphetamines. Yet Rooney later publicly denied this version of events, telling journalists that Garland was never given drugs by MGM, that Louis B. Mayer did not sanction anything harmful for her, and that no one at the studio was responsible for her death. He insisted she chose that path herself. This denial may have been protecting MGM. It may have been minimizing his own experiences. Or it may reflect genuine differences in how the system affected different performers. What it certainly demonstrates is how difficult the truth remained to acknowledge even decades later. Elizabeth Taylor explicitly stated she did not receive drugs as a child at MGM. She recalled directors and studio heads pushing the boundaries of child labor laws regarding hours, but experienced no pharmaceutical intervention. Her serious prescription drug and alcohol problems developed later as an adult after injuries and personal traumas. This variation matters. The studio system did not destroy everyone it touched in identical ways. Some performers were more vulnerable. Some had more protection. Some resisted more effectively. But the system itself created the conditions where exploitation could occur, and when it did occur, the machinery existed to conceal it. Part 6. The Legal Cracks in the Foundation. While Judy Garland was breaking down during The Pirate, the legal foundation of the studio system that was destroying her was beginning to crumble. Two separate legal challenges between 1943 and 1948 would fundamentally alter the structure of Hollywood's empire. The first came from actress Olivia de Havilland. In 1943, she sued Warner Brothers over the studio's practice of extending 7-year contracts indefinitely through suspension clauses. The studio had suspended her 7 times for refusing unsuitable roles, approximately 25 weeks total. Warner Brothers claimed she owed them 6 additional months of actual service beyond 7 calendar years from her contract start. On December 8, 1944, the California Court of Appeal ruled unanimously in de Havilland's favor. The decision established that the 7-year limit in California Labor Code meant 7 calendar years, not 7 years of actual service. The right to terminate employment after 7 years was declared inalienable and could not be waived by contract. Judge Charles S. Burnell's original Superior Court decision used even stronger language, declaring the studio's suspension practice constituted peonage or illegal servitude that could result in contracts being indefinitely extended, even to the point of constituting life bondage for the employee. The de Havilland Law, as it became known, remains in effect today. Jack Warner attempted to blacklist de Havilland for her defiance. She signed with Paramount instead and won 2 Best Actress Oscars within 5 years. For the studio system, the decision ended the ability to indefinitely extend contracts through suspension. It forced renegotiation with actors whose 7-year anniversaries had passed, and it encouraged performers to seek independence or freelance arrangements once their contracts expired. The second legal blow came 4 years later. On May 3, 1948, the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in United States versus Paramount Pictures that the studio's ownership of production, distribution, and theater chains created an illegal monopoly. The decision prohibited block booking, banned discriminatory practices favoring studio-owned theaters, and ordered divestiture of theater chains. The studios had controlled only 17% of American theaters, but those theaters generated 45% of film rental revenue. The vertical integration that had made the studio system so powerful was declared illegal. Following the decision, each major studio signed consent decrees agreeing to divest their exhibition divisions. Paramount split into separate production and theater companies. RKO, already struggling, would eventually collapse entirely. The others survived by transforming their business model completely. The combined effect of these 2 decisions was devastating to the old system. Studios could no longer afford or justify long-term talent contracts without guaranteed exhibition. Actors gained leverage to negotiate project by project. Independent production became financially viable. And the entire economic model that had created and sustained the Dream Factory began to dissolve. But these changes came too late for Judy Garland. Her contract had been signed in 1935, well before the de Havilland decision. She remained trapped in an agreement that had already destroyed her health by the time the legal protections emerged. Part 7, The Final Breaking. After the relative success of Easter Parade, MGM pushed forward. In February 1947, the studio had purchased the Broadway musical rights to Annie Get Your Gun for a record $650,000, specifically for Judy Garland. Producer Arthur Freed and composer Irving Berlin both approved the casting. It should have been her greatest triumph. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. The production was troubled from the start. The controversial choice of director Busby Berkeley, the same director whose demanding methods had put Garland on bed rest during Girl Crazy, immediately created tension. Garland had just completed a grueling year of work from March 1948 through March 1949 with minimal rest. She had been promised an 8-month vacation. It never happened. Filming began April 4, 1949. Between March 25 and April 1, Garland had pre-recorded the entire score, 8 complete musical numbers including There's No Business Like Show Business and Anything You Can Do. On April 6th and 7th, she filmed Doin' What Comes Naturally on the exterior Wilson Hotel set. Then the pattern resumed. On April 7th, she dropped a rifle on her toe, requiring x-rays. By April 9th, she called in sick with a sore throat, arrived late, and left at 3 in the afternoon stating she was too ill to work. During filming of I'm an Indian 2 between April 27th and May 2nd, assistant choreographer Alex Romero reported having to physically hold her up to prevent her from falling. On May 3rd, Arthur Freed viewed the existing footage and fired Berkeley, stating he had no conception of what the picture was all about. Charles Walters was brought in as replacement director. He met privately with Garland, who told him, "It's too late, Chuck. I haven't got the energy or the nerve anymore." May 10, 1949 became the terminal day. Garland called at 7:30 in the morning saying she had overslept and had a bad night, but might come in. She arrived on set at 11:18, made up but not in costume, complaining of severe migraine. She rehearsed for 37 minutes. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a studio executive delivered a letter firing her from the film and citing her as responsible for substantial delays. No one in production, not Walters, not the choreographer, not the crew, knew the letter was being delivered. Garland's response was simple: "I shall never come back, now or ever." Louis B. Mayer ordered production closed at 2:10 that afternoon. Approximately $1,877,000 had been spent. 2 complete musical numbers had been filmed. All of it would be scrapped. Betty Hutton was loaned from Paramount as replacement. The film resumed in October with yet another new director, George Sidney, the third director after Berkeley and Walters. When released in May 1950, it became MGM's biggest musical hit of the year, earning over $8 million. On May 29, 1949, Garland entered Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston for treatment of prescription medication dependence. MGM paid for the hospitalization. The official reason for her removal from Annie Get Your Gun was habitual tardiness and failure to report to set. But the actual reasons included physical and mental exhaustion from overwork, no vacation as promised, prescription drug dependency that the studio had created, and unrealistic expectations given her recent health struggles. The machine had broken its most valuable component. Part 8, The Last Attempt. MGM gave her one more chance. In late May 1950, Garland was brought back from the third week of a promised 8-month vacation to replace pregnant June Allison in Royal Wedding. Charles Walters was the original director, but withdrew, telling producer Arthur Freed he could not make it through another film with her after the grueling summer stock production. Stanley Donen replaced him. Rehearsals began May 23, 1950. 2 songs were written specifically for Garland. Only one photograph is known to exist from this production, showing her and Fred Astaire in costume. On June 16, 1950, she worked her final day at MGM, 3 months shy of 15 years at the studio. On June 17, at 11:25 in the morning, she called stating she had woken with a migraine and could not make the 1 o'clock rehearsal call. The studio immediately fired her from the film and placed her on suspension. She had not yet pre-recorded any songs. Only $20,604 had been spent, just rehearsals and costume tests. 2 days later, on June 19, the same day she was scheduled to begin pre-recording, Judy Garland attempted suicide at home. While talking with her husband Vincente Minnelli and her secretary, she ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and screamed, "Leave me alone, I want to die." Minnelli broke down the door with a chair and found her with a broken bottle. She had made a superficial scratch on her throat, requiring only a bandage. The incident made international headlines. But this time, public opinion sided with Garland rather than MGM. The carefully constructed narrative that the studio had maintained for years, that she was simply unreliable, difficult, unprofessional, collapsed in the face of obvious human desperation. That summer, Summer Stock was released, Garland's final completed MGM film. Audiences burst into spontaneous applause after her numbers. Her fan mail quadrupled, with 90% supportive. The film became a surprise hit despite posting an $80,000 loss due to costly shooting delays. MGM held internal meetings beginning August 1 about whether to keep her. The debate revealed the studio's calculus with brutal clarity. She was still valuable. The public still loved her. But the risk had become unacceptable. On September 19, 1950, MGM agreed to let Judy Garland out of her contract. The official termination occurred September 29, 1950, exactly 15 years to the month after her first audition in September 1935. She requested the release, and the studio granted it. For decades, the public assumed she was fired. The departure was officially mutual, though the reasons behind it were anything but. The cited reasons included habitual tardiness, intoxication, poor physical health, unreliability, and costly production delays. All of these were true. All of them were consequences of what the studio had done to her. Part 9, What Came After. On October 11, 1950, 12 days after her contract ended, Judy Garland appeared on Bing Crosby's radio show. Crosby had invited her knowing she was depressed and running out of money. He introduced her simply, "We got a friend here. She's had a little trouble recently. She needs our love. She needs our support." The audience response was overwhelming. Between November 1950 and March 1951, she performed in over 12 radio shows at $1,500 per appearance. In 1951, she embarked on a European concert tour to sold-out crowds. In April 1951, she achieved her legendary comeback at the London Palladium, later recalling, "I suddenly knew that this was the beginning of a new life. Hollywood thought I was through." She starred at New York's Palace Theater for over 20 weeks, starting October 1951, earning a special Tony Award. In 1954, she starred in A Star is Born, produced by her thwarted husband Sid Luft, earning an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. The comeback was real. The damage was permanent. Judy Garland would struggle with prescription drug dependency for the rest of her life. She would marry 5 times. She would experience extraordinary professional highs and devastating personal lows. And on June 22, 1969, at age 47, she would die from an accidental barbiturate overdose in a London apartment. The drugs that killed her were the same drugs MGM had normalized when she was 15 years old. Part 10. The Price of Perfection. When The Pirate was finally released in May 1948, Variety reviewed it on December 31, 1947, before general release. The review made no mention of production troubles. It focused entirely on the film's artistic merits. The Pirate is escapist film fare, Gene Kelly and Judy Garland team, delightfully. The full story, that the film cost nearly $4 million and became the only Garland film to lose money for MGM, that its star nearly died making it, that it represented the beginning of a 3-year collapse that would end her studio career, remained hidden from the industry's official record for nearly 3 decades. That story only emerged in retrospective books published in 1970s through 2000s. This concealment was not accidental. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The studio fixers, Howard Strickling and Eddie Mannix, had orchestrated Garland's relationships, arranged her psychiatric care, managed her hospitalization, and controlled every piece of information that reached the public. When she broke down, they sent her away. When she recovered enough to work, they brought her back. And through it all, they maintained the public image of MGM as a benevolent dream factory that created magic. The absence of specific doctor names from all historical records reflects this same system. Despite extensive research across biographical, academic, and medical history sources, the physicians who actually prescribed the amphetamines and barbiturates remain largely anonymous. We know the pharmaceutical brands, Benzedrine, Dexedrine, Seconal, Nembutal. We know the system's mechanics from Garland's own testimony and corroboration by Debbie Reynolds decades later. But the medical personnel remain protected by deliberate opacity, destroyed records, and distributed responsibility across multiple prescribers. One source states producers had Garland going to 6 different doctors for prescription drugs without any one doctor knowing about the other 5. This fragmentation made it impossible for any single physician to understand the full extent of what was being done to her. It also made accountability impossible. A doctor identified only as working at 20th Century Fox, not MGM, told a biographer years later, "In those days, pills were seen as another tool to keep stars working. The doctors were caught in the middle. If one doctor would not prescribe, there was always another who would. Everyone was using pills." This was the culture. This was what Hollywood had normalized. The pharmaceutical control of performers was not an aberration but standard operating procedure, justified by the economic pressures of the studio system and the belief that stars were assets to be optimized for maximum return. The legal reforms that ended the studio system's most exploitative practices, the de Havilland Law in 1944 and the Paramount Decree in 1948, came too late for those already trapped. Garland's contract had been signed in 1935. By the time the protections existed, the damage was done. The weekly movie attendance that made the studio system economically viable plummeted from 90 million Americans in 1946 to 46 million in 1958. Studios sold facilities for television production and transitioned from vertically integrated production companies to primarily financing and distribution entities. The package unit system emerged with temporary assemblages of talent for individual projects rather than long-term contracts. The dream factory died, but not before it had consumed those who built it. The spring 1947 collapse during the filming of The Pirate's Voodoo number remains partially obscured by conflicting documentation and deliberate silence. Multiple biographical sources describe a severe breakdown. Wally Worsley's daily production reports say nothing. The truth exists in that gap, in what the system needed to hide even from itself. What is not disputed is the pattern. Judy Garland missed 99 days out of 135 during that production. She was hospitalized for 2 weeks following a suicide attempt in July 1947. She returned to work and completed Easter Parade successfully, then broke down again during Annie Get Your Gun in 1949, was fired, hospitalized again, brought back for one final attempt in 1950, and finally released from her contract after 15 years. This was not the story of one troubled star. This was the story of a system that treated human beings as production units to be chemically optimized for maximum profit extraction until they broke. Louis B. Mayer either directly ordered or approved the drug distribution. Producer Arthur Freed later directed Debbie Reynolds to get vitamin shots from his doctor, the same protocol that had destroyed Garland. The fixers Howard Strickling and Eddie Mannix orchestrated relationships, arranged hospitalizations, and controlled information. And behind them all was a corporate structure that prioritized quarterly earnings over the lives of the performers who generated those earnings. The pharmaceutical introduction began when Garland was between 13 and 17 years old. By 18, during The Wizard of Oz, she was fully addicted. The long-term consequences included severe psychotic episodes, debilitating insomnia and hallucinations, multiple nervous breakdowns, multiple suicide attempts, firing from MGM at 28, and death from barbiturate overdose at 47. The voodoo number that broke her was cut from the pirate entirely. Louis B. Mayer allegedly ordered the negative burned, fearing the sexual choreography would invite police raids. No footage survives. It likely was destroyed in the 1965 MGM vault fire. So the moment that represented Judy Garland's breaking point no longer exists except in disputed memory and deliberate silence. The set where it happened was dismantled. The studio that created it was dissolved. The system that made it possible collapsed under its own contradictions and legal challenges. What remains is a documentary record that confirms systemic exploitation intersecting with personal crisis to create predictable catastrophe. The trade press maintained silence while gossip columnists broke the story using euphemisms. Studio production memos documented delays without acknowledging causes. And the official version, exhaustion, unreliability, unprofessional behavior, obscured a reality of pharmaceutical dependency, systematic exploitation, and institutional cruelty. Years later, Judy Garland spoke honestly about what had been done to her. She described the pills, the schedules, the exhaustion, the loss of control over her own life and body. Some of her contemporaries corroborated her account. Others denied it. The industry that had created situations spent decades controlling the narrative even after the system itself had collapsed. But the essential truth cannot be obscured. A 13-year-old girl was signed to a contract that gave a corporation ownership of her professional life. That corporation administered amphetamines to maximize her productivity and barbiturates to manage the consequences. It controlled her diet, her image, her relationships, and her access to medical care. When she broke down, it concealed the crisis. When she recovered enough to work, it put her back into production. And when she finally became more trouble than she was worth, it released her with a damaged body, a ravaged mind, and an addiction that would follow her for the rest of her life. The studio system that did this was not an anomaly in American capitalism. It was American capitalism functioning exactly as designed, extracting maximum value from human labor while externalizing the costs onto the workers themselves. The Dream Factory produced dreams for audiences and nightmares for those who made them. MGM's motto was more stars than there are in heaven. The slogan suggested abundance, glamour, celestial perfection. What it actually described was a system that burned through human beings as if they were inexhaustible resources, discarding them when they broke and replacing them with fresh talent that did not yet understand the cost. Judy Garland understood the cost. She paid it across 3 decades of struggling with addiction, mental illness, financial instability, and the physical consequences of years of pharmaceutical abuse. She achieved extraordinary artistic triumphs despite this damage. Her performances in A Star is Born, her concert appearances, her television specials, these demonstrated that even a system as brutal as the studio machine could not completely destroy her talent. But it destroyed her life. That is not melodrama. That is documented historical fact. The Austin Riggs Center, where she was treated for 2 weeks in July 1947, offered progressive psychiatric care that emphasized talk therapy and patient autonomy rather than the invasive procedures common in that era. It represented the best that mid-century psychiatry could offer. Yet 2 weeks of humane treatment could not undo years of systematic exploitation. The underlying issues remained unresolved: continued studio pressure, ongoing access to prescription medications, unresolved trauma, lack of sustainable support systems. She returned to work because the economic structure of her life gave her no choice. She was in debt to MGM for various expenses the studio had advanced her. She had a daughter to support. She had a career identity built entirely around being an MGM star. And the alternative, breaking free at age 25 with no financial resources and a severe drug dependency, was not realistically available. So she went back. And the pattern continued until the system itself could no longer sustain it. The firing from Annie Get Your Gun on May 10, 1949, documented in extraordinary detail by Assistant Director Al Jennings's memo, reveals the mechanism perfectly. Garland arrived on set at 11:18 in the morning, made up but not in costume, complaining of severe migraine. She rehearsed for 37 minutes. At 1:30, a letter was delivered firing her and citing her as responsible for substantial delays. The studio had already spent nearly $2 million. 2 complete musical numbers had been filmed. The entire score had been pre-recorded. But MGM made the calculation that continuing with Garland was more expensive than scrapping everything and starting over with a replacement who could maintain a schedule. This was not personal cruelty. This was institutional logic. The system had created Garland's unreliability through years of pharmaceutical exploitation. When that unreliability became too expensive, the system discarded her. The studio that had manufactured her dependency then punished her for being dependent. Betty Hutton replaced her, and the film became a massive hit. The public never knew that every musical number they were watching had originally been designed for someone else, someone who could not complete it because the same studio that was now profiting from the replacement had destroyed her capacity to work. Today, The Wizard of Oz is considered one of the greatest films ever made. Over the Rainbow is recognized as one of the most important songs in American cultural history. Judy Garland's performance is seen as iconic, defining, perfect. None of that is wrong. The artistry was real. The talent was extraordinary. The emotional truth she brought to that performance and dozens of others remains powerful nearly a century later. But we rarely discuss what it cost to create that perfection. We celebrate the dream while forgetting the machinery that produced it. We remember Garland as a troubled star rather than as a victim of systematic exploitation. And we treat her addiction as a personal failing rather than as the inevitable consequence of being fed amphetamines and barbiturates from age 15 by the corporation that controlled every aspect of her life. This selective memory serves a purpose. It allows us to continue enjoying the art without confronting the conditions under which it was made. It preserves the mythology of Hollywood as a place where dreams come true rather than as an industrial system that extracted maximum profit from human labor regardless of human cost. The documentary record, the production memos, the hospital admissions, the suicide attempts, the testimony of those who witnessed it, tells a different story. It tells us that a 13-year-old girl was fed into a machine that ground her up systematically and called the result magic. It tells us that institutions will exploit vulnerable people as thoroughly as economic logic permits unless legal and social structures prevent them from doing so. And it tells us that the cost of that exploitation is borne by individuals long after the institutions that profited have moved on. Judy Garland died in 1969. Louis B. Mayer had died in 1957. Arthur Freed died in 1973. Howard Strickling died in 1982. Eddie Mannix died in 1963. The MGM studio system they built and operated had effectively ended by 1960, dissolved by legal challenges, changing economic conditions, and the inevitable consequences of its own unsustainable practices. But the legacy continues. The films remain. The songs endure. And the mythology of Hollywood's golden age persists, sanitized of the exploitation that made it possible. When we watch The Wizard of Oz today, we see a young woman in a gingham dress singing about a place over the rainbow where troubles melt like lemon drops. We are moved by the innocence and hope in her voice. We feel the emotional truth of her performance. What we do not see is the amphetamines she had been taking to maintain the production schedule. We do not see the studio doctors who prescribed them. We do not see the system that would continue feeding her those pills for another decade until she broke completely. And we do not see the 47-year-old woman who would die from an overdose of the same category of drugs that the studio had normalized when she was a child. The collapse on the set of The Pirate in spring 1947 was not the beginning. It was the moment when the accumulation of years of exploitation became impossible to conceal, even temporarily. The sealed soundstage, the roaring fires, the pounding drums, the woman in the expensive costume screaming that they wanted her to burn. This was not metaphor. This was a human being reaching the absolute limit of what she could endure. And when she reached that limit, the system sent her away for 2 weeks, then brought her back and put her into another production. That is what we need to remember. Not as gossip or tragedy or cautionary tale, but as documented historical fact about how institutions function when profit matters more than people. It was not a fall from grace. It was the slow, systematic unmaking of a girl who had carried an empire on her back. The spotlights dimmed long ago. The sets were struck and the sound stages repurposed. The contracts that bound her dissolved into historical artifacts. But the voice remains, captured on film and recording, singing about somewhere over the rainbow. We hear the beauty. We should also remember the cost. That is what the documentary record demands. That is what Judy Garland's life, in all its damaged brilliance, requires us to acknowledge. The machine that created her broke her. That is not interpretation. That is not speculation. That is what happened, and we should never forget it.